how I made this in Blender. Hi, I'm Jerry. I'm a 3D animator and CGI artist. Here's behind the scenes of how I created this cinematic moonlight forest in Blender. Without further ado, let's get started. Before opening Blender, I spent some time gathering references. I wanted the environment to feel calm, mysterious and illuminated by the moon, so I collected images of forests, streams, moonlit landscapes and atmospheric lighting, because even the professionals use reference. It's a thing. With my reference ready, I jumped into Blender and started by setting up my workspace. I placed the camera where I wanted the final shots to be, so I could constantly preview how the scene was coming together as I worked. For the water, I kept things simple by just using a basic plane. Next, I began blocking out the environment. For the mountains, I used Blender's built-in A.N.T landscape add-on. You can find that in the preferences to quickly generate the land large forms. At this stage, I wasn't worried about the details. I just wanted to establish the overall composition and silhouette of the scene. Since this was only the blocking phase, the focus was on getting the scale, layout and proportions right before moving on to the more detailed work. Once the basic layout was in place, I started adding vegetation. For the grass, I used a free Blender add-on called the Plant Library, which provided a collection of grass assets for the scene. Rather than scattering the grass across the entire terrain, I used Blender's particle system together with weight painting. This allowed me to control exactly where the grass would grow, giving me much more artistic control over the environment. Weight painting also helped with performance. If the particle system covered the entire mesh, it would generate far more grass than necessary, making the entire scene much heavier and slowing down the viewport. By limiting the particle density to only the visible areas, I was able to keep the scene both efficient and visually convincing. And one thing to keep in mind, small optimizations like this become really important as your scene grows in complexity. Another thing that really improved the realism of this scene was layering different types of grass. Real environments aren't made up of just one plant species, they're a mix of different grasses and vegetation. That variation helps break up repetition and makes the scene feel much more natural. I learned this from one of Kaizen's environments tutorials.
Hold up, wait a minute, something ain't right.
Hell no.
If you're enjoying the video and you'd like to see more Blender projects like this, consider subscribing. It really helps support the channel and it's free. Please do. Please. With the grass in place, it was time to add the trees. For this, I used Blender's sapling tree generator, which is a free flexible tool for creating procedural trees with different shapes, sizes and branching patterns. Note, if you're using Blender 5.1 or newer, you might notice that the sapling tree generator isn't listed under the traditional add-ons menu anymore. Instead, you'll need to install it through Blender's Get Extensions section before you can use it. Once it was installed, I generated several different tree variations and placed them throughout the environment to help build the forest. I still added more trees from the plant library to help populate the scene. With the main forest taking shape, I turned my attention to the foreground. I created a separate terrain to give myself more control over the composition and to add extra depth to the scene. For the mountains in the background, I added another particle system to distribute vegetation across its surface. Since the mountain will be covered with thousands of instances, performance became an important consideration. To keep the scene efficient, I first applied a decimate modifier to reduce the poly count of the meshes that would scatter across the mountain. Because these assets were mostly viewed from a distance, lowering their poly counts had very little impact on the final image while significantly improving performance. I also used weight painting to control exactly where the particles will appear. Instead of covering the entire mountain, I limited the distribution to the areas visible to the camera. This reduced the number of generated instances and kept the scene much more responsive while I worked. Everything was going smoothly until I made the classic Blender mistake. I imported a bunch of high poly rocks, completely forgot to optimize them, and Blender politely introduced itself to the desktop. The worst part, I hadn't saved. Fortunately, Blender's autosave came to rescue, so I didn't have to rebuild the entire scene. With the environment mostly complete, it was time to create the stream. My first thought was to use Blender's Ocean modifier, but after a few tests, I realized it wasn't the right tool for this scene. The waves were simply too large and too energetic for the calm, peaceful stream I had in mind. So instead of forcing a full simulation, I took a much simpler approach. I created the water using a custom shader with a bit of subtle geometry to give it just enough surface variation.
Oh my god, bro. Oh, hell no, man. What the fuck?
Blender crashed the second time. For some reason that I don't know about, I was just doing clay and test renders, but Blender magically shut down. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to do any more recordings after then. But creating the fog is actually much simpler than it looks. Here is another scene I created in Blender. Just a chair next to a window with a bright light coming in. I started by adding a cube that covered the entire area where I wanted the fog to appear. Next, I created a new material for the cube, removed the principled BSDF and replaced it with a principled volume shader. I connected it to the volume input of the material output node. For the lighting, I used a spotlight shining through the window and increased its power to around 2000 watts. The exact value will depend on your own scene. To keep the fog subtle, I reduced the density to around 0.05 as a little goes a long way, and you can always adjust it depending on the scale of your scene, so don't be afraid to experiment. Finally, the god rays are created naturally as the light passes through the trees. With the volumetrics in place, the entire scene immediately felt more atmospheric and helped sell the moonlight mode I was going for. And for the little fireflies below, I used Blender's particle system to create that. All I did was I used an icosphere as the render object, and that icosphere had an emission shader which enabled it to shine even though it's low poly. And that, my friends, is how I created this moonlit forest in Blender. And apparently, I wouldn't go down into the compositing and editing. I did that in Photoshop. And of course, there are a lot of Photoshop tutorials out there that you can follow to create beautiful results from your renders. Please do not forget to like, subscribe, comment, and share.